Welcome to The Compliance Life for the month of July. This month, my guest is Joseph Burke, most recently the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer at Quest Software. He details his journey to and from the CCO chair. In this part one, we take up Joe's early life, academic, and early professional career. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the July edition of The Compliance Life. This month, I am thrilled to visit with Joseph Burke, or Joe Burke. I've known Joe for quite some time. He has been a mainstay in the compliance profession for really quite a while. So, Joe, first of all, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to share your story with me.
Thanks, Tom. I'm excited to talk to you about it.
So, Joe, could you tell us about your academic career and perhaps your early years after you moved into the legal profession?
Sure. I started my early academic life up in Buffalo, New York, where I'm originally from. I went to Canisius College for a year. And while I was there, studied French and began sort of my focus on history. I spent the next year, in the SUNY, State University of New York program in France for a year in Grenoble. And then from there, I transferred to the University of Virginia, where I graduated. So a pretty splintered sort of college experience, and then spent a year at home with my parents up in Buffalo. And then I went to Fordham Law School in New York City. I had always wanted to be in New York. My dad and I had talked about going to school there in New York, which would make it easier for me to get a job there. And it really worked out well. I went to Fordham for the duration. I made it to the International Law Journal, became an editor in my last year there. Unfortunately, my dad passed away in my third year of law school, and so that was a bit of a challenge. But I had put myself in a pretty good position to be able to find work up there in New York, and I worked for a law firm, Donovan, Leisure, Newton and Irvine, which doesn't exist anymore. But at the time was sort of a litigation-based firm that did some corporate work, and I became a corporate and transactional lawyer working on M&A and private placements and so forth, and really sort of a routine kind of entry into the legal profession in a corporate environment that, at least in my impression at the time, was not highly pressured.
So, for those who don't know Donovan Leisure, first of all, its founder was Wild Bill Donovan. So that
From
makes it
Buffalo.
notable in and of itself. But it was really a white shoe, very prestigious New York firm. They came out to Michigan and interviewed, and they were very well received, highly thought of. It's what we in Michigan certainly thought of as one of the top tier New York firms. What was it like to work there? And maybe could you tell us a little bit more about your practice at Donovan Leisure?
Sure. Well, it was a great firm to work at. It did have some of the characteristics of some of the old white shoe firms. When I started there, this was in 1986, and for the entire time I was there for 4 years. I left in 1990. They had two elderly women who, at 10 o'clock and at 2:30, would bring around a tea and cookies cart and visit literally every office. They knew people's orders, so if you liked Malamars, you were going to get Malamars whether you were sitting in your office or not. And just an indication of some of the old school style of it. But it was really a great firm. I met a partner there, Peter Smith, who I worked with for the entire 4 years I was there, taught me more about securities law and transactional law than I ever could have learned in law school. And in fact, I met my future mother-in-law at the firm. I met her daughter sitting in her office waiting for a ride home from work one day. But her mother-in-law was my mother-in-law was actually a real estate lawyer. So I learned a little bit about real estate as well. It was really a very family-oriented firm. I know a lot of firms back then were. Partners that had been there for ages and really loved the firm and firm life. And Donovan was one of those places where, I think people went to spend their entire career. And I actually thought I might do that. It turned out not. It turned out I decided that an in-house environment might be better for me pretty quickly. But it was just a wonderful firm to be a part of, and it came to an end far too soon.
So after Donovan Leisure, you moved over into the corporate world. What was your first job there? What did you handle, and was it a culture shock?
Yeah, it was definitely a culture shock. I decided, my wife and I, when we got married in 1989, decided that New York City was not the place that we wanted to raise kids, and so I started looking for other opportunities. I don't know if you remember, in 1989, really the real estate market was in a terrible position, and honestly, the economy wasn't great. And I remember the recruiter saying to me, "Look, if you want to move out of New York, I can get you a job next week. If you want to stay in New York, it might be a year." Well, I quickly found a spot at Pepsi. Pepsi at the time owned the restaurants Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, and KFC. And they had an opening down in Louisville, Kentucky at Kentucky Fried Chicken, which always brings a smile to people's lips when they hear that I worked for Kentucky Fried Chicken for 6 years. But it was a great job. I mean, I worked for, believe it or not, the R&D department at Kentucky Fried Chicken, and I supported, they had a minority loan guarantee program for franchisees. I worked with finance. I worked with the IT department. They had a very far-sighted IT guy who ended up going to Nike and running Nike's IT for a while after he left KFC. So I was really lucky. The culture shock was in going from a place in New York where the workday started at 9:30 but usually didn't end till 10 o'clock p.m., I think on a pretty routine basis. It was a much more of a 9 to 5 kind of thing down in Kentucky. And so there was this sense that not that it was easy, but that I wasn't doing enough. You get into this environment where, you've got lawyers that have a life and can go home at 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening and have dinner with their kids and maybe do a little reading or following up in the evening. Of course, in the early 90s, we weren't doing quite as much email as we're doing today. But yeah, it was a bit of a culture shock. First, to leave New York. And not be sitting. I was very lucky at Donovan Leisure. We were in the Rockefeller. We were in 30 Rock, and I was on the 40th floor. And so, to now be sitting on the first floor of a corporate building in suburban Louisville was just that was probably the biggest culture shock for me.
Well, once again, for our perhaps younger cultural aficionados, you said two key things. One was you correctly pronounced Louisville, not Louisville, Louisville. And Louisville. Number two, you correctly articulated the name Kentucky Fried Chicken. It's not KFC, it's Kentucky Fried Chicken. So kudos there. And finally, you talked about the kind of economic downturn. They called it the Bush recession. I was practicing law in Houston and had started practicing law in '83. And Houston was, the energy industry was just decimated. And the economy of the Bush recession actually elevated the Houston economy. So we thought things were going pretty good because they'd been so bad. I have done some franchise work, so I was wondering if you could say a few words about the franchise relationship. And I know you weren't in compliance then, but did that sort of, I guess you would call it an internal joint venture partner is what a franchisee is. And so I've always been intrigued by the questions around compliance and franchisees, not really from the legal perspective of do you have to do it, but the relationship is typically so structured that franchisees kind of follow what the franchisor says. Kind of what did you learn about that relationship while you were at Kentucky Fried Chicken?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, you're absolutely right. I think from a lawyer's perspective, the franchise relationship is 100% contract-based, right? I think the franchisee, in most instances, did not approach it as a contract relationship. It was a family relationship, and particularly with Kentucky Fried Chicken and the Colonel, who frankly had been a huge part of the operation, frankly, until shortly before I joined the company. The Colonel was friendly with many of the franchisees that we had, even in 1990 when I joined the firm. I think the most important aspect of the franchise relationship is, as anybody would understand in a contract relationship, the franchisor, the corporate entity, held all the cards. However, if you could make your franchise go, and if you could grow that franchise into additional units, you could really generate a lot of influence and a lot of leeway in the way that you run your business with the franchisor. The things that were most important to us were image, following franchise process, obviously the revenue and the franchise fees. But frankly, if the concept worked, which of course KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken is still around today, if the concept worked, you could make a lot of money, but you had to follow the rules of the contract that I think caused a lot of smaller franchisees to stumble. They wanted to run their business. They knew that they were in charge of running the business that they had franchised or that they had signed up for a franchise for. But sometimes they didn't quite understand the extent to which that contract governed what they did. And that's where there was friction, is where you'd have somebody that says, well, I know how to run this business. I know how to run a restaurant business. But they didn't necessarily fully buy into everything they'd signed up to in the franchise contract.
You really said something I find very interesting, Joe, and that's when you referred to franchisees and many times feeling that this was a family. And I really have a kind of a two-part question around culture. I've talked to a lot of compliance officers and legal types who've worked in major iconic U.S. brands. And they said one of the things was, and you also touched on it, they didn't want to destroy, obviously didn't want to destroy the reputation, but they didn't want to do anything to impinge the reputation. And they felt like they were standing on the shoulders of people who had come before them, but their role at that point was to carry on and carry it on for the next generation. So they had a lot of pride in getting it right. And you did mention that. I wanted to ask you, did that sort of culture exist both at the corporate office, the franchisor office, but then you talked about the family relationship. Could you say a few words about culture and the culture of Kentucky Fried Chicken and how you all really emboldened that culture through what you and I agree was a contractual business relationship?
Sure, absolutely. One of the things that I had never heard of before I got to Kentucky Fried Chicken was the concept of kerneling. And this was a verb that we used, and of course, Colonel Sanders was the brand. But Colonel Sanders, running his restaurant, and franchisees ever since then, the successful ones, had a way of connecting with their customers, even in a fast food restaurant, of walking around the restaurant from time to time, of making sure that they would visit the cash registers when somebody was checking out, of really connecting and what we called kerneling, making sure that customer had a good experience in the restaurant. That's what the good franchisees did. And I think that culture, and even the use of the odd word kerneling, had such a strong hold on the successful franchisees. They wanted to be part of something bigger than just this contract, bigger than just this restaurant. And I think what they did was they had the touchstone of the Colonel in this concept of being an ambassador for the brand and for their own franchise. So absolutely, that was a big part of the franchise. The family aspect was a little bit different. We had a couple of guys, one guy, and I'm blanking on his name right now. He had been a basketball player at the University of Kentucky. He had worked at Kentucky Fried Chicken for 25 years. He was beloved. I mean, the biggest going away party I've ever seen anywhere I've ever been. This guy was family to so many employees at the headquarters operation because he'd been there so long, because he was Kentucky Blue, and it was really, to me, the first time I saw, that sort of family approach. I talked a little bit about it with the law firm, but I saw that sort of approach of a guy who really dedicated his whole life to an administrative role at Kentucky Fried Chicken and made the most of it and was considered family when he left.
Well, Joe, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but I was wondering if our listeners wanted any more information on you or any of the topics you've touched on, what would be the best way to reach you?
the best way to connect with me is through LinkedIn. That's what I use to connect with everybody out there in the world. So that's where I am today.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you for listening to this episode 1 of our 4-part series with Joe Burke on the July edition of The Compliance Life. I hope you will join us for episode 2, where we take a look at his move to Dell Technology in Round Rock and into compliance.